Hello, my name is Charlie Swartz, and today I will be doing my presentation on the Great Irish Famine. This was an event that occurred in Ireland throughout the mid 1840s into the 50s and caused millions to starve, suffer, or entirely leave the country. Today I will be doing a deep dive into some of the content of this terrible famine and how it affected Ireland, the rest of the world, and how it continues to do so to this day. This is the content I will be discussing with you today. Most of it isn't very pleasing, but it is important to be shared. Things like this event don't get covered very much in history, and it's important to do so. A lot of important things happen during these times, and it's important to learn from them and don't make the same mistakes again. Things like relying on a certain crop maybe a little bit too much, or the government responding in a certain way that I'm sure you probably won't be the biggest fan of as we go deeper into this. I'm also be talking about things like charity. And charity comes from unlikely places in this kind of story. The evictions that occurred because of the crazy laws and the immigration that came out of the evictions. It's kind of a never ending sequence. And then the aftermath of all of that. So without further ado, let's get into it. So, the causes and contributing factors of the Irish famine. The first one is Ireland's reliance on the potato. As you can see in the graph, the potato cultivation in Europe, aka the percentage of arable land for Ireland, is 32%. This is almost double Belgium and triple pretty much the rest of Western Europe. Now, the reliance on the potato was for a couple of reasons, which I will get into more later, but to kind of state a little bit on it, the Ireland's reliance on the potato kind of stems from a lot of peasants being around and the nutritional value that they got from it and the way it could grow. I'll leave it at that for now. We can dive more into that in a little bit. Another thing was Britain's role in Irish economics and policies. A lot of people say that this famine wasn't a cause of blight, but more so a cause of England's response to the famine, and if they had responded in another way, perhaps that famine wouldn't have killed so many people and caused so many other people to leave. Another thing was the land tendency. This kind of goes along with Britain's role because they had a lot to do with this, but kind of just the struggle for tenants to pay rent and get evicted, and they didn't have anywhere to go. So there were certain things put in place that just worsened lives for them. It was not a good thing for them. So this is a timeline of kind of how the Irish famine occurs. 1841 is when the population peaks for Ireland. It hit 8 million people, I believe. If you get a little bit more precise, it was around 8.4. This will be the highest that Ireland hits population-wise ever. To this day, they have not fully recovered, although they have begun to get quite close to that number again. I believe they are now, with the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland combined, right around that 7 to 8 million mark. So they're on their way up, but it's crazy that 200 years later they still haven't quite recovered from that. In 1841, Ireland was not industrializing. They were actually doing the opposite. Rural work was on the rise. Industrialization was down about 14%, from 42 to 28% over the course of 1820 to 1840. And things kind of started to look a little bleak. I know that with the population wise, they had been the fastest growing country in Europe, growing their population by about 50% in the 50 years prior to this famine. However, in the 10 years prior, it had only grown about 3.5%, so you can kind of see how it kind of slowed down the closer we've gotten to this famine, how the kind of things aren't starting to look so hot for them. So 1845 is when the beginning of the famine occurs and blight is discovered. It's discovered in September, October, and it's seen that around 50% of the crop is destroyed. They dug up the plants and they were inedible, they were ruined. There was nothing they could do about it. And this was something that would happen for the next couple of years, and the same things would continue to occur. Now, nowadays we spray for blight, but blight was not understood at the time, and so panic kind of set in for these farmers who didn't know what they were going to do. Now, our first character to introduce is Robert Peel, the current Prime Minister, or not current, at the time of the Great Famine, 1845. He is the current Prime Minister of England, and he thinks it's being overestimated and exaggerated, and kind of laughs at the Irish and says they're known for doing this, and doesn't really do much about it. There's a question of repealing the corn laws. And that became a big conversation. Now, if you don't know what the corn laws were, they were laws that restricted the amount of foreign grain imported. Remember, in Ireland and England, corn is not what we think of it as. It's more of a grain, it's a barley, wheat, things of that sort. It's any of that, and it restricted the amount of foreign grain imported, which became a problem when we dug up the potatoes and saw that, hey, these aren't edible. And then England still wanted to import food from Ireland to England, causing Ireland to starve itself. Not a very good look for the English. Yeah. These protectionists from England didn't want to repeal them. However, later on, it was repealed anyways, thanks to Robert Peel partly. He was one of the few that wanted this to get repealed, and he was considered like a kind of a modern founder of the free trade, and encouraging that throughout this. However, unfortunately, because of the corn laws, he resigned in December of 1845. From Prime Minister, and his rival will eventually take over, and we'll get to him shortly. However, at the very end of 1845, England does something that's not so bad. They bring in $100,000 of Indian corn. It's imported to help feed people. It was done secretly, so the private enterprises and local reliefs are not disrupted, and the economy can keep going how it's supposed to. At least that's the idea. Now, Indian corn, it's a little different than Irish corn, and they didn't really exactly know what to do with it. It actually had a nickname called Peel's Brimstone, or Brimstone, which is a rock, kind of showing the taste of it, and it wasn't the highest quality, but it got the work done, and it was food, so I'm sure they were grateful in that time. Moving on to 1846, we have Charles Trevelyan, who was the permanent secretary at the Treasury for England. He is quite the character, and if you are like I, you will not like him by the end of this. He is not my favorite person. Even though we share kind of the same name, I don't like that. He believes that landlords and ratepayers are responsible for providing relief to the Irish, which leads to these landlords increasing rent and forcing people out, beginning the evictions that will continue to happen for the next couple of years and terrorize Ireland, causing mass emigration and forever hurting them because of this. the landlords and ratepayers being responsible means that they had to increase their rates for the rent and for charging tenants for things, causing tenants not being able to afford that since they were putting all their money towards not starving, something like that. And unfortunately, that didn't work out too well for really anybody in this situation. Um, Public works began to be developed, things like fisheries, road repairs, and drainage to provide employment for people that were unemployed and didn't have jobs. Um, it wasn't very much. It was around 0.65% of the population was in this, and something that England was saying they were doing, but weren't really putting their whole effort into, and eventually kind of fell apart. This was when John Russell, who was a part of the Whig Party, compared to Peel being part of the Tory Party. The Whig is more conservative, and he was not a fan of helping out Ireland. He thought they were lazy and selfish and shouldn't be asking for all this money. It was rough. It was really rough. A report came out, funnily enough, from Charles Trevelyan, who will be the last of him, saying public workers should be paid in food or only enough money to not starve. He basically didn't want to be held accountable if they were dead. But he didn't want to pay them more than to just barely keep them alive, and was just kind of working them through the public works. It was a rough time to be an Irish man. From June to November, the number of people in public works multiplied by a factor of 10. It went from around 20,000 to 200,000. And this is the beginning of the height of the famine, and when everything gets real bad. Towards the end of the year, prices in County Cork shot up 50% in 1 week alone for things like bread, milk, and other food. Children were seen by a midshipman that were mistaken for decrepit old women, their faces wrinkled, their bodies bent and distorted with pain, their eyes looking like those of a corpse. These children were even starving, and they were being forced to work to provide for their families. Children were, oh man, it was a terrible thing for them. Grain depots eventually also opened up at the very end of the year to provide more food for the Irish by the English, but this was something that would get consistently opened up and shut down, and wasn't a very consistent food source for the Irish. On to 1847, which is seemingly the worst year of the famine. People in Donegal were living off of seaweed. Public work employees triples from 200,000 to 600,000, and eventually goes up to, I believe, the number is 750,000, which is insane for a population of, at the time, got down to around 6 million. That's over 10%. The English opened up soup kitchens, which allowed people to get food and so prevent starving, which didn't really do too much in the soup kitchens. Didn't last too long, but they were something, and that can be noted. Even though there were things like the soup kitchens and the grain depots, there were still 100 starvation deaths a day throughout the country. In workhouses, which were houses that people could go live in once they got evicted or just couldn't afford to live anywhere, they gave us somewhere to go and provided relief. There are 2,700 deaths a week in these workhouses throughout the country. Temporary Relief Act was at its peak at around 2.4 million people getting relief. It was a crazy amount of people being affected by this famine. And this is kind of when Ireland hit its rock bottom, I feel like. And this is kind of when the immigration gets going. People are leaving in mass to places like Canada, New York. By 1850, 26% of New York is said to be Irish Americans. Uh, and they will continue to have a dominant place in many places, a dominant culture in many places. 1848, things kind of start to maybe get better. The number of people on outdoor relief peaked. This was something similar to do with the workhouses, and over 1 million people were getting daily relief from the poor laws. Things like the workhouses, stuff like that, they were getting relief from those. However, if you owned more than a quarter acre of land, you couldn't receive benefits, which made it tough because a lot of these people suffering had maybe a little bit of land, and it wasn't even good land, but they owned land, or they were forced to give it up in order to receive these benefits, and it was a very rough time for these people, forced to give up their property and their houses and homes and their towns in the search for food. Now, in June, things in the northeast towards Belfast in the northern land start to kind of recover due to the linen industry, imports of crops, and some large yields of other crops. However, for the rest of the country, it's not looking too great. In August, blight reappeared on the west coast and began to spread, and it was just as bad as it was in the 1846 and 47. Even a cholera began to appear. Evicted families were homeless. Men were deserting families to even leave the country. Man, it was not a good time. Moving on to 1849. The beginning of the year, they go through a cholera outbreak. For those who don't know, cholera is a disease that is not quite enjoyable. A rate and aid bill passes, which is a property tax that kind of increases poverty, it could be said, and makes it tougher to buy more property due to the tax. And people already didn't have much to begin with. It was designed to increase the aid to Ireland, but really, did it? We don't really know. Also, Queen Victoria visits and proclaims how well it was in Ireland, even though it wasn't really, or was she just saying that to get a good look? Also, cholera is a bacterial disease. It causes things like diarrhea and dehydration. It's spread throughout the water. It can be fatal. And so going through that is not a fun time at all. It can be deadly. Just another thing to add on to the poor Irish. Finally on to 1850 and kind of the 51. Normal harvest finally takes place. A second rate-in aid bill was introduced, although was it legal and was it needed after the first rate-in aid bill? Who knows? I don't really think so. This is kind of the end of the famine, and the census was taken in 1851, and from 1841 it went down to 6.5 million people. Without the famine, it would estimated that they would have been over 9 million at the same time. So it's a difference of about 2.5 million people. And that's at the time, not counting the future generations that will forever be gone. So, why potatoes? This might be the most important question to the Irish famine. Why potatoes? Why did they rely on them so heavily? So the first reason is kind of the type of land that was accessible to peasants. It was perfect for growing potatoes. the nice thing about growing potatoes is that they kind of can grow anywhere and are pretty versatile, which for the Irish peasants that meant great things, considering they lived on land that was bog-like and rough. Wasn't great terrain for growing things like wheat, other grains um, that needed a bigger space, or other kinds of nutrients. The potato just was a great salad crop. It also only needed a quarter of the land comparing to wheat to grow, which is a pretty impressive thing. They can grow the same amount as a quarter acre as you could on a 1 acre for wheat, which is very nice for peasants that didn't have any money and couldn't afford large lots of land. Another thing that was probably the main reason why they grew potatoes was it could feed an entire family just off of a quarter acre and one cow. You could feed your entire family and everything would be okay. It might be bland and not the most interesting of meals, but you would survive and you'd have good nutrients and be healthy. Um, Potatoes provided almost triple the calories that things like wheat do, and so it was a great option for many of the poor people, and often was the only option, considering that a lot of the others were exported to England due to the corn laws. I have already mentioned how England didn't stop importing crops from Ireland during the Great Famine, and that made the Irish furious. They were stealing their food while they were already starving, and taking high value food too, instead of importing it from other countries due to these corn laws that haven't really been repealed yet. The John Russell administration and the Whig Party seemingly did not care about Ireland during the famine and did minimal work to take care of the Irish people. Throughout this famine, they kept on calling the Irish lazy, selfish, and unable to work for themselves, relying on the English to take care of them, which was just not true. In fact, the English seemingly didn't do much, only providing little help here and there through soup kitchens or like the poor law, which was a property tax that brought in workhouses and outdoor relief, which was where people who couldn't afford their payments or didn't have anywhere to live could go to receive relief for being poor. So it's in the name for that one, which is kind of nice. But yeah, the government's response was not favorited by the Irish, and is one of the many reasons why the Irish don't always love the English to this day. Hundreds of years before this took place, English Protestants had gotten land from Elizabeth I in an attempt to kind of destroy the Roman Catholicism in Ireland. And so because of that, they received this land and became kind of these absentee landowners that rented out this land to tenants. Unfortunately, the system did not work very well. These tenants were tenants at will and could therefore be evicted whenever, without reason, and didn't really ever get any supplement if they did get evicted. Compensation, I guess, would be a better word for that. This was believed to be kind of deserved by the English, and they weren't keen to give much charity or empathy towards the Irish. They believed the Irish were paying for their sins via the starvation and disease, that they had done something wrong for some reason. These landowners were also not receiving help. If they owned over a quarter acre of land, like I mentioned before, they could not receive assistance from the government, in the sense of like the poor laws, and so they were stuck trying to fend for themselves, even though they might still be very poor and just own a quarter acre of land, which is not very much at all in the grand scheme of things. So, one of the really cool things about the Irish famine was actually the charity events that occurred because of it. Things like the Sultan of Turkey delivering $10,000 worth of goods. Um, and England only wanted them to donate 1,000 because that's how much Queen Victoria of England was donating and didn't want her to look bad. But regardless of that, the Sultan of Turkey donated 10,000 anyways. And the English even attempted to stop him from doing so, but they eventually made it to Ireland and successfully made their donation. Another thing, there's this quote, disturbing trade by Americans. Ireland, or, I'm sorry, not Ireland, the English didn't want Americans to donate their money because they believed it would disrupt and disturb the trade made in Ireland. Um, However, even through that, $400,000 in donations were made, and there was letters posted, I believe, by a publisher in Philadelphia. Letters in many different Irish newspapers thanking them for that. There's also the problem of the poor law preventing private charity. Um, with the introduction of the poor law, people didn't have that extra money to give out anything in past famines, because this is, I don't want to say a common thing, but it's definitely occurred before this in England and Ireland, and they had extensive private charities that gave out money, and that wasn't a thing anymore due to the poor laws and the taxation of their property. They weren't able to really do so much, especially the Irish. They were just not in the right place to be able to do that, which is kind of a shame. On to the emigration. So there was, as I mentioned, there was an influx of immigration to U.S., Britain, places like Liverpool, um, Canada, even Australia, which is kind of far away. As you notice, these places all kind of speak English and have similar traits. Also, all been colonized by England. Love that. Since 1800, approximately 10 million people born in Ireland have left. Now this is from 1800 all the way up to today, not just from 1800 to 1850. Lots of these people immigrated permanently and did not return to Ireland, which is kind of a shame, but it shows the rest of the world, Ireland. I believe there are around 80 million people worldwide that identify as ethnically Irish, even though there are only under 8 in actual Ireland. So it's very cool to see that despite this tragedy and this tragic event, that because of this, immigration was a huge part, and now there are 80 million people worldwide who celebrate Ireland. Another cool statistic is from 1850 to 1860, around 80% of immigrants to America were Irish, and I believe around 1860, at the same time, around 6% of America's total population was Irish, and 25% of New York City was Irish. It's kind of some cool statistics about the immigration to America. The aftermath of the famine. So, the Irish lost around 3 million people from 1841 to 51. The main causes of it being starvation and emigration to other countries. The sad part of it is kind of the lost potential of the population, and once you realize how many people they would have had today, they lost around 27 to 36 million people, which would be around triple to quadruple their population that they have. and the setback that they have because of not having that advantage is terrible. They're still struggling to reach around 8 million people in population. Now, however, on the positive note, their economy did get hit hard from this, obviously, over the past 200 years. However, Ireland is known to pull above its weight in that sense. I believe they have the 26th biggest population in the EU, or in Europe in general, but they have the 11th biggest economy, pulling way above their weight, and kind of showing that they may not have many people, but they know how to work. Another really sad thing is the Irish language decreasing in use. A lot of the native speakers of the Irish language lived out in the West and the South, which were where there were more Irish-speaking citizens, and now, today, there are barely anything. It's practically eliminated. There are very few towns that speak it. It's very sad to see. I was just in Ireland in May, and there are a lot of signs that have the language written on it, but speaking-wise, everyone seems to speak English, and didn't encounter anybody speaking Irish, unfortunately. So, a little analysis of the government's role in all of this. By this, I mean the English government. So, the real cause of famine was colonialism. This was a question that I've been kind of pondering in my head. As I mentioned, the English had a lot to do with this and how they kind of could have prevented it, except they thought the Irish were lazy and didn't want to provide a lot of charity and kind of prevented other people from even giving them charity. Also, the way that they treated the peasants, making them work long shifts, the way they fed them, making them practically starve, and working in the workhouses, makes them feel like they weren't treating them really like kind of humans, and like they were just colonizing them. Same thing kind of with the religion aspect of it too, converting them from Roman Catholicism to being Protestant, as England was. Things like public works, workhouses, and soup kitchens were all things that they did do, but were they very helpful overall? Who really knows? And could they have done more? Absolutely. They definitely seemed quite reluctant to help. And even like things with the soup kitchens, they were concentrating people into smaller areas with more people, which just helped spread disease and probably make people starve. It was not a great look for the Whig Party throughout this adventure. Also, at the beginning of the famine with Robert Peel and his government, he might have done a little bit better, but still reluctant to help, even though it didn't last the longest. This is my works cited page, and before I end this presentation, I will go over some of the locations I received my research from. The first three are pictures I used throughout my presentation. These pictures all have something to do with the famine. For example, the previous slide was a picture of the Donnemore Museum, which is an old workhouse. The next few are journals and articles. They were to ask questions on why the famine occurred, what came out of it, things like emigration, and why the peasants played such a crucial role in this society during the famine. All in all, thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I appreciate you putting in the time to this. Thank you.